I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sitting at a kitchen table wiping tired eyes after a long day, or maybe you're watching beside a child whose laughter you helped raise, even if no one ever calls you family. She saved his daughter's life, yet he called her worthless. The truth would destroy everything he believed about love. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're caring for a child that isn't yours, setting a dinner table, or waiting for someone to say thank you. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of the Remington penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side, casting long shadows across marble floors that had never known the warmth of bare feet running across them. Maria Gonzalez moved silently through the pristine hallways, her worn sneakers making no sound against the cold stone. In her hands, she carried a tray with Emma's breakfast, scrambled eggs cut into tiny hearts, orange juice in a crystal glass that cost more than Maria's monthly rent in Queens, and a single wildflower she'd picked from Central Park during her early morning walk to work. At 52, Maria carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned that love doesn't always come with recognition. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a simple bun. Her hands, scarred from years of cleaning other people's homes before this job, moved with the gentle precision of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others. She wore the same navy cardigan she'd owned for 8 years, not because she couldn't afford another, but because Emma once said it smelled like vanilla and safety. The penthouse stretched before her like a museum of wealth that felt more like a mausoleum. Jonathan Remington's net worth exceeded $40 million, with investments scattered across tech stocks, cryptocurrency portfolios that included substantial Bitcoin holdings, and real estate properties spanning from the Hamptons to Aspen. The morning financial reports lay scattered across his mahogany desk, displaying numbers that represented more money than Maria would see in several lifetimes. Yet for all its grandeur, the space felt hollow, beautiful but breathless, like a painting of a home rather than a home itself. Maria knocked softly on Emma's bedroom door before entering. The 7-year-old girl was already awake, sitting by her window with her knees drawn up, watching the city come alive below. Emma's dark curls fell around her face like her mother's once had, and her green eyes, so much like Jonathan's, held a sadness that no child should carry. She had been only 2 when her mother, Isabella, died in a car accident, leaving behind a fortune built on Fashion Empire shares and a daughter who barely remembered her voice. "Good morning, mi amor," Maria whispered, setting the tray down and sitting on the edge of the bed. Emma's face brightened. The only genuine smile that ever crossed her features was reserved for Maria. "Did you sleep well?" Emma shook her head, crawling into Maria's lap with the familiarity of a daughter seeking her mother's comfort. "I had the dream again," she murmured against Maria's shoulder. "The one where everyone disappears." Maria's heart clenched as she held the child closer, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. These were the moments that made everything else bearable. The cold dismissals from Jonathan, the sideways glances from the other staff who whispered that Maria was getting too attached, the loneliness that settled into her bones each night when she returned to her small apartment in Astoria. Emma's need for her was real, pure, uncomplicated by the social barriers that defined every other relationship in this gleaming tower of wealth. "You know what I think," Maria said, gently stroking Emma's hair. "I think dreams like that happen when our hearts are trying to tell us something important. They remind us to hold tight to the people who matter." She lifted Emma's chin so their eyes met. "And you matter to me more than all the stars in the sky." This had been their routine for 6 years now, ever since the Remington Employment Agency had called Maria with what seemed like an answer to prayer. She had been cleaning office buildings at night, her back aching from bending over keyboards and emptying trash cans when the offer came. The salary was more than she'd ever earned, enough to send money to her sister's family in Puerto Rico, enough to maybe save a little for the future she'd stopped believing in after her husband Carlos died of cancer, leaving her childless and adrift at 46. But what drew Maria to the Remington house wasn't the money or the prestige of working on the Upper East Side. It was the photograph the agency showed her. A sad little girl standing beside her father at some corporate event, both of them looking like beautiful strangers, even to each other. Maria had recognized something in Emma's eyes that mirrored her own deepest wound, the ache of love that had nowhere to go. The morning sun climbed higher as Maria helped Emma dress for school, listening to the child's excited chatter about a drawing she'd made of the two of them at the zoo. Emma's private school cost more per year than most people's salaries, but education was just another line item in Jonathan's vast financial portfolio. What couldn't be purchased was the patience Maria showed when Emma struggled with her shoelaces, or the way Maria remembered that Emma preferred her sandwiches cut diagonally, or how Maria never failed to notice when Emma was fighting back tears over some playground drama. "Maria?" Emma asked as they walked toward the elevator that would take them to the lobby where the driver waited. "Why doesn't Daddy eat breakfast with us anymore?" The question landed like a stone in Maria's chest. Jonathan had grown increasingly distant over the past year, buried under the pressure of expanding his hedge fund and dealing with federal investigations into some of his investment strategies. The breakfast table that had once hosted at least perfunctory morning conversations now sat empty except for Emma and Maria. Jonathan was usually gone by 6 a.m., leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and coffee that cost more per pound than Maria's weekly grocery budget. "Your daddy works very hard to take care of you," Maria said carefully, the diplomatic answer she always gave. What she didn't say was that Jonathan seemed to confuse providing with loving, that his idea of fatherhood had become a series of financial transactions rather than emotional connections. The trust fund he'd established for Emma contained enough money to secure her future for several lifetimes, but he couldn't remember the last book she'd read or the name of her best friend at school. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Maria caught their reflection in the polished brass doors. Emma leaned against her side with complete trust, and Maria's hand rested protectively on the child's shoulder. They looked like what they were, a mother and daughter bound not by blood but by choice, by the thousand small moments of care that had woven them together over the years. The lobby of the Remington building was all glass and chrome, designed to impress rather than welcome. Other wealthy residents moved through the space with the brisk efficiency of people whose time was measured in dollars per minute. Maria nodded respectfully to the doorman, who had long ago stopped treating her as just another employee, and now greeted Emma with genuine warmth. It was one of the small dignities Maria treasured, being seen as the person who mattered most to this little girl, even if only by the building staff. Outside, the city hummed with its familiar energy. The private car that took Emma to school each day represented another layer of the Remington fortune, not just the vehicle itself, but the driver's salary, the insurance, the maintenance, all carefully managed by the family's financial advisors. Maria had grown accustomed to this world of casual wealth, but she never forgot that it wasn't hers. She was a visitor here, valued for her service, but always aware of her place in the hierarchy that money created. During the drive to Emma's school, Maria listened to the child practice her Spanish vocabulary words. This had been Maria's idea, to give Emma a connection to a wider world beyond the rarefied air of Manhattan's elite. Jonathan had initially been skeptical, wondering aloud why his daughter needed to learn the helps language, but Emma's enthusiasm had won him over, especially when her teachers praised her linguistic abilities. What he didn't understand was that for Maria, teaching Emma Spanish was about more than language skills. It was about sharing her culture, her history, the warmth of family traditions that money couldn't buy. "Mira, Maria," Emma said, pointing to a street vendor selling flowers on a corner. "Flores bonitas." Her pronunciation was getting better, and Maria felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with salary or recognition. These were the victories that sustained her. Watching Emma's confidence grow, seeing the child develop empathy and curiosity about the world beyond her privileged bubble. When they arrived at the school, Maria walked Emma to her classroom, carrying her backpack and lunchbox. The other parents and nannies formed their usual clusters, some polite but distant, others warm enough to exchange pleasantries. Maria had learned to navigate these social dynamics carefully, never presuming too much familiarity, but maintaining the dignity that Emma deserved to see in the woman who raised her. "I'll see you at pickup," Maria promised, giving Emma a hug that lasted just long enough to fill the child's emotional reserves for the day ahead. "Remember, you are smart, you are kind, and you are loved." Emma's teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, approached as other children filed into the classroom. "Maria, I wanted to thank you again for the cultural presentation last week." Emma was so proud to share stories about Puerto Rico with the class. "You've given her such a beautiful connection to her heritage." The words warmed Maria's heart, even as they highlighted an irony she lived with daily. Emma's heritage included her mother's Italian roots and her father's English ancestry, both well documented and celebrated. But it was Maria's Puerto Rican culture that had captured the child's imagination, giving her stories of family gatherings and traditional recipes, of music that made people dance and celebrations that brought communities together. Maria had become Emma's bridge to a world where love was expressed in abundance rather than scarcity, where family meant more than financial security. Walking back to the penthouse alone, Maria allowed herself these few minutes of reflection. The morning routine with Emma was the highlight of her day, the part of her job that felt less like work and more like purpose. But now came the other aspects of her employment, the cleaning, the organizing, the invisible labor that kept the Remington household running smoothly while Jonathan focused on his business empire. The loneliness that she carried like a constant companion seemed heavier during these quiet hours when Emma was at school, and Jonathan was locked away in his study, orchestrating deals worth millions of dollars. Maria moved through rooms that showcased wealth but felt empty of life, straightening already perfect cushions and polishing surfaces that gleamed like mirrors, but reflected nothing warm or welcoming. Sometimes, as she worked, Maria caught glimpses of the life she might have had if circumstances had been different, if Carlos hadn't gotten sick. If the fertility treatments had worked, if the modest dreams she'd once harbored, a small house, children's laughter echoing through the rooms, Sunday dinners with extended family, had come to fruition instead of crumbling into medical bills and grief. But she'd learned not to dwell on these parallel universes. Instead, she channeled her maternal instincts into caring for Emma, finding in that relationship a purpose that transcended her official job description. By the time she needed to leave for Emma's school pickup, Maria had transformed the penthouse back into its state of pristine perfection. Every surface gleamed, every item was in its designated place, every trace of human habitation had been erased, except for the subtle signs that someone who truly cared lived here too. Fresh flowers in Emma's room, healthy snacks prepared for after school, small comforts that spoke of love rather than luxury. The afternoon routine was Maria's second favorite part of the day. Emma would emerge from school full of stories about her classmates, her lessons, the small dramas and triumphs that filled a 7-year-old's world. During their walk through Central Park or the ride home, Emma would process her day with Maria the way children do with their mothers, completely, trustingly, holding nothing back. These conversations revealed how intelligent and perceptive Emma was becoming, but they also showed Maria how much the child craved connection beyond their relationship. Emma asked constant questions about why her father worked so much, why they didn't have family dinners like her classmates, why the penthouse felt so quiet compared to the warm chaos she witnessed in other homes. Maria chose her answers carefully, always protecting Jonathan's dignity in his daughter's eyes while trying to satisfy Emma's need to understand her place in the world. It was a delicate balance, being honest enough to help Emma process her emotions while remaining loyal to the family that employed her. But sometimes, in Emma's most vulnerable moments, Maria allowed herself to offer the comfort that came most naturally, the sense that Emma was cherished completely, that her worth had nothing to do with her father's wealth or her mother's absence, that she was loved simply for being herself. Back at the penthouse, the afternoon hours unfolded with their familiar rhythm. Emma would do her homework at the kitchen table while Maria prepared dinner, both of them chatting about everything and nothing in the comfortable intimacy they'd developed over 6 years together. These were the moments Maria treasured most, the ordinary magic of daily life shared with someone who had become as precious to her as any child she might have carried in her womb. But even in these peaceful interludes, Maria remained aware of her precarious position in this household. She was essential but expendable, needed but not truly valued, love without status or security. The knowledge that her relationship with Emma existed at Jonathan's discretion was a constant source of anxiety that she worked hard to hide from the child. Emma's happiness depended on feeling secure in Maria's presence, so Maria wore her own uncertainty like an invisible burden, never allowing it to shadow the warmth she offered this little girl who had become her world. The sound of Jonathan's key in the lock announced his arrival home, usually around 7 o'clock, after the financial markets had closed and his last conference calls were complete. Emma would light up at the sound, hoping tonight might be different, that her father might join them for dinner or ask about her day with genuine interest. But more often than not, Jonathan would nod briefly in their direction, grab a plate of whatever Maria had prepared, and disappear into his study with his laptop and phone, leaving Emma's expectant face to fall with disappointment that broke Maria's heart every single time. During these evening hours, when Emma was occupied with books or quiet games and Jonathan was unreachable behind his study door, Maria felt the full weight of her isolation most keenly. She existed in the space between worlds, not quite family, not quite staff, essential but invisible, needed but never truly seen. The silence in the penthouse during these hours felt heavy with all the conversations that never happened, all the connections that money couldn't purchase, all the love that was offered freely, but never acknowledged as the gift it was. As bedtime approached, Maria would guide Emma through their nighttime routine, a warm bath, brushing teeth, selecting tomorrow's clothes, and then the most precious part of their day together, story time. Emma's room was decorated with every luxury imaginable, from custom-made furniture to toys that cost more than many people's monthly salaries. But what Emma treasured most were the stories Maria told, not from books, but from memory and imagination, tales passed down through generations of mothers who understood that children need magic as much as they need material comfort. In the soft glow of Emma's nightlight, as Maria's voice wove stories of brave princesses and wise grandmothers, of families that stayed together through every challenge, the outside world faded away. Here, in this sacred space of bedtime stories and whispered good nights, Maria allowed herself to feel what she could never say aloud, that this child was hers in every way that mattered, that the love between them was real and transformative, that they had created something beautiful and lasting despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "Maria," Emma would whisper as sleep began to claim her, "will you always be here?" "Always," Maria would promise, meaning it with every fiber of her being while knowing that such promises were not hers to make. "Close your eyes now, mi amor. Dream of all the people who love you." And as Emma drifted off to sleep, Maria would sit for a few more minutes in the darkened room, memorizing this peaceful face, storing up these moments against an uncertain future, loving with the fierce protectiveness of a mother, while knowing that officially, legally, she was nothing more than an employee whose services could be terminated at any time. The contrast between the depth of her love for Emma and the precariousness of her position created a constant tension that Maria carried in her body like a physical ache. She wanted to believe that the bond she'd built with this child was unbreakable, that 6 years of devotion and care had created something that transcended employer-employee relationships. But she also knew how quickly wealthy families could pivot, how easily someone in her position could be replaced if circumstances shifted or if new priorities emerged. Walking home to her small apartment in Astoria each night, Maria would ride the subway surrounded by other working people ending their days, some heading home to families of their own, others, like her, returning to solitude. The train would carry her from the gleaming towers of Manhattan back to the more modest neighborhoods of Queens, from a world of marble and crystal to one of worn linoleum and fluorescent lights. The transition always felt jarring, a reminder of the vast gulf between the life she lived during working hours and the reality of her own circumstances. Her apartment was small but tidy, decorated with photographs of Emma and mementos from their time together, drawings the child had made, little gifts she'd crafted in school, proof that their relationship extended beyond Maria's professional duties. These artifacts of love were Maria's most precious possessions, more valuable to her than any of the luxury items she handled daily in the Remington penthouse. But the apartment also held reminders of the life Maria had lost. Photographs of Carlos, their wedding album, medical bills that had long since been paid but that she kept as evidence of their struggle against his cancer. In quiet evening moments, as she prepared simple meals for one and watched Spanish-language television shows that reminded her of home, Maria would sometimes feel the full weight of all she had sacrificed and lost. Carlos's death had left her not just widowed, but childless, cut off from the future they had planned together. Yet Emma had given Maria's life new purpose and meaning. Caring for the child had awakened maternal instincts that grief had buried, reminding Maria that she still had love to give, that her capacity for nurturing hadn't died with her husband's dreams of fatherhood. Emma's need for her had become Maria's salvation, a reason to wake up each morning with hope and energy, a reminder that sometimes family is created through choice rather than biology. The weekends presented their own unique challenges and rewards. Emma would often ask to visit Maria's apartment, curious about her life beyond the penthouse, eager to see where Maria lived when they weren't together. But such visits were complicated by the social boundaries that governed their relationship. Maria was expected to maintain professional distance, to remember that she was the employee, and Emma was the employer's daughter, regardless of the emotional bonds that had developed between them. Instead, their weekend time together often took place in Central Park, where they could move more freely beyond the constraints of the Remington household. Maria would pack picnics and they would spend hours exploring, feeding ducks, riding the carousel, creating memories that felt more authentic than anything that happened within the marble walls of the penthouse. These excursions gave Emma glimpses of a different kind of life, one where joy came from simple pleasures rather than expensive entertainment, where attention was freely given rather than purchased. During these park visits, Maria would sometimes encounter other caregivers, nannies, grandmothers, mothers, who formed the invisible network of women who raised Manhattan's children while managing their own complex lives. In conversations with these other caregivers, Maria found understanding and solidarity. They shared the particular challenges of loving children who weren't officially theirs, of navigating relationships with employers who valued their services but didn't always see them as fully human, of finding meaning and dignity in work that society often undervalued. These connections reminded Maria that her experience wasn't unique, that across the city there were thousands of women like her, immigrants, widows, mothers whose own children were grown, who poured their hearts into caring for other people's families while managing their own dreams and disappointments. It was a community bound together by shared understanding rather than geography, by common purpose rather than common background. But even within this community of understanding, Maria's relationship with Emma felt special, deeper than mere professional obligation. Other nannies would comment on the obvious love between them, the way Emma sought Maria's comfort and approval, how the child seemed to bloom in Maria's presence. These observations both validated and worried Maria, confirming what she knew to be true while highlighting how vulnerable such deep connections could become if circumstances changed. As autumn settled over New York City, painting Central Park in brilliant colors that Emma loved to collect in leaf piles, Maria began to notice subtle shifts in the Remington household. Jonathan was working even longer hours, often staying at his office until well past Emma's bedtime. When he was home, he seemed distracted and tense, frequently taking calls that required him to speak in hushed, worried tones. The financial newspapers that had always been scattered around his study were now marked with yellow highlighter and filled with margins notes that suggested anxiety rather than confidence. Emma, with the perceptiveness that children develop when their emotional needs aren't being adequately met, began asking more questions about her father's absence and mood changes. She would wait by the windows in the evening, watching for his car to pull up to the building, only to have him arrive home too late and too exhausted to give her the attention she craved. These disappointments accumulated in Emma's sensitive heart, creating a sadness that no amount of expensive toys or elaborate activities could address. Maria found herself becoming even more central to Emma's emotional well-being during this period, serving as the stable, loving presence that anchored the child's world when everything else felt uncertain. She increased her efforts to create warmth and security within the household, planning special activities, cooking Emma's favorite meals, maintaining the routines that gave the child a sense of safety and predictability. But she also began to worry about what these changes might mean for her own future. Jonathan's stress seemed related to his business concerns, and Maria knew from overheard phone conversations that his investment portfolio had suffered significant losses in recent months. The cryptocurrency market, where he had substantial holdings including Bitcoin investments, had become volatile, and some of his major stock positions were underperforming. While his overall wealth remained substantial, the psychological impact of financial setbacks was clearly affecting his mood and decision-making. During this uncertain period, Maria made a decision that would later prove both prophetic and dangerous. She began keeping a small journal, recording not just Emma's daily activities and development, but also her observations about the child's emotional needs and responses. The journal became a place where Maria could process her own growing attachment to Emma, documenting the small moments of joy and connection that made her job feel like a calling rather than mere employment. Writing in the journal each evening became a form of meditation for Maria, a way of honoring the relationship she had built with Emma while also preparing herself for the possibility that circumstances might force them apart. She wrote about Emma's first words in Spanish, the way the child's face lit up during their park adventures, the quiet conversations they shared during bedtime stories. The journal became both a celebration of their bond and a preparation for potential loss. One particularly cold November evening, as Maria was finishing her journal entry and preparing for bed, her phone rang with an unexpected call from her sister Rosa in San Juan. Rosa's voice was tight with worry as she explained that their elderly mother had fallen and broken her hip, requiring surgery and extended care. The family was hoping Maria might be able to come home for a few weeks to help with their mother's recovery. The request put Maria in an impossible position. Her loyalty to her family in Puerto Rico was absolute, but she couldn't bear the thought of leaving Emma during such an uncertain time in the child's life. Jonathan was already absent both physically and emotionally. If Maria left as well, Emma would be truly alone except for the other household staff who, while kind, had neither the authority nor the deep connection necessary to provide the comfort and stability Emma required. After a sleepless night of deliberation, Maria made the difficult decision to ask Jonathan for a brief leave of absence. She would arrange for a temporary replacement, someone she trusted to maintain Emma's routines, and she would return as quickly as possible. It seemed like a reasonable request, especially given her 6 years of dedicated service and the family emergency that necessitated her travel. But when Maria approached Jonathan the next morning, she found him in his study, surrounded by financial documents and looking more haggard than she'd ever seen him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually impeccable appearance was disheveled. The stock market reports spread across his desk showed red numbers and downward arrows, clear indicators of the mounting pressure he was under. "Mr. Remington," Maria began carefully, "I need to speak with you about a family emergency." Jonathan looked up from his papers with visible irritation, as if her request was just one more problem he didn't have time to address. "What is it, Maria?" "I'm dealing with some urgent business matters." Maria explained the situation with her mother, emphasizing that she would only be gone for 2 weeks and that she would find qualified temporary care for Emma. She spoke about the replacement nanny she had in mind, a trusted colleague who understood Emma's routines and needs. She tried to make her request sound as professional and minimally disruptive as possible. Despite the emotional weight of both her mother's situation and her worry about leaving Emma. But as Maria spoke, she watched Jonathan's expression grow increasingly cold. The financial stress he was under, the pressure from his business associates, the feeling that his carefully controlled world was slipping away from him. All of it seemed to crystallize into resentment toward this woman who was supposed to make his life easier, not more complicated. "Absolutely not," he said sharply, cutting off Maria's explanation mid-sentence. "I don't pay you to abandon your responsibilities here for your personal problems. If your family situation is so important to you, perhaps you should reconsider whether this job is right for you." The words hit Maria like physical blows. In 6 years of employment, Jonathan had never spoken to her so harshly, had never questioned her dedication or professionalism. The unfairness of his response, treating her family emergency as a betrayal rather than a human need, revealed something about how he truly viewed her role in his household. She wasn't a valued team member whose personal circumstances deserved consideration. She was a service provider whose convenience should never inconvenience him. "I understand your concerns, sir," Maria managed to say, her voice steady despite the hurt and anger building inside her. "But my mother—" "Your mother is not my responsibility," Jonathan interrupted. "Emma is what I pay you for. If you can't prioritize that, I'll find someone who can." The threat hung in the air between them like a poisonous cloud. Maria realized that her 6 years of devotion, her obvious love for Emma, her countless unpaid hours of worry and care, none of it had created the job security or respect she had hoped for. She was still, after all this time, completely dispensable in Jonathan's eyes, valued only for her immediate utility, rather than her proven commitment to his daughter's well-being. "I need time to think about this," Maria said quietly, her dignity intact despite the humiliation of Jonathan's dismissal of her family's needs. "Don't take too long," Jonathan replied, already turning back to his financial documents. "I need to know that you're fully committed to this position, or I need to find someone who is." Maria left the study feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The secure job that had given her life meaning and purpose suddenly felt precarious. Dependent not on her performance or Emma's happiness, but on Jonathan's arbitrary decisions and volatile moods. The conversation had revealed the ugly truth beneath their professional relationship, that for all her importance to Emma, she remained powerless in the face of Jonathan's authority, vulnerable to decisions that could destroy her life without regard for the emotional bonds she had formed or the dedication she had shown. That evening, as Maria went through her usual routines with Emma, homework help, dinner preparation, bedtime stories, she carried the weight of uncertainty like a physical burden. Emma, with the sensitivity of a child who had learned to read adult moods for her own emotional survival, sensed that something was wrong. "Are you sad, Maria?" Emma asked during their bedtime routine, studying Maria's face with concern. "Just thinking about grown-up things, mi amor," Maria replied, forcing a smile that she hoped would reassure the child. "Nothing for you to worry about." But she could see that Emma wasn't convinced, and the thought of this perceptive, loving child losing another important person in her life made Maria's heart ache with protective fury. Emma had already lost her mother. The idea of her also losing the primary source of maternal love in her life because of her father's callousness felt like a cruelty too great to contemplate. That night, Maria called Rosa back to explain that she couldn't come home for their mother's recovery. Rosa was disappointed but understanding, knowing how much the Remington job meant to Maria both financially and emotionally. They would find other arrangements for their mother's care, even though Maria's nursing background and loving attention would have been invaluable during the recovery process. The sacrifice Maria made, choosing Emma over her own mother's needs, was one more example of the impossible choices that defined her life as a caregiver without power. She loved Emma like a daughter, but she wasn't Emma's mother. She had devoted herself to this family, but she wasn't family. She had made herself indispensable emotionally while remaining completely dispensable legally and financially. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the Remington household grew increasingly tense. Jonathan's business problems seemed to be escalating, leading to longer hours, shorter tempers, and even less attention to Emma's emotional needs. Maria found herself serving not just as Emma's caregiver, but as a buffer between the child and her father's mounting stress, trying to maintain stability and warmth in an environment that felt increasingly cold and unpredictable. Emma began having nightmares more frequently, waking up in tears and seeking comfort in Maria's arms. The child's anxiety seemed to be a direct reflection of the household's emotional climate, and Maria spent many long nights sitting beside Emma's bed, offering reassurance and comfort that no one else in the family seemed capable of providing. These middle-of-the-night conversations became some of their most intimate moments, times when Emma would share her deepest fears, and Maria would offer the unconditional love that every child deserves, but not every child receives. During one of these late-night conversations, Emma asked the question that had been building in her heart for months. "Maria, why doesn't Daddy love me the way you do?" The question was like a knife in Maria's heart, not because it was difficult to answer, but because the answer revealed such a painful truth about Emma's life. How could she explain to a 7-year-old that her father loved her but didn't know how to show it, that wealth and emotional availability weren't the same thing, that sometimes the people closest to us are the least able to give us what we need? "Your daddy loves you very much," Maria said carefully, stroking Emma's hair in the darkness. "Sometimes grown-ups show love in different ways. He works hard to make sure you have everything you need." "But I need him to talk to me," Emma whispered. "I need him to ask about my day and laugh at my jokes and read me stories like you do." Maria's throat tightened with emotion. Emma's needs were so simple, so reasonable, so heartbreakingly normal. A child wanted her father's attention, approval, and affection. She wanted to feel important to him, to know that her thoughts and feelings mattered in his world. These weren't extravagant requests. They were the basic emotional nutrients that every child required for healthy development. "I know, sweetheart," Maria whispered back, "and maybe someday he'll learn how to do those things better. But until then, you have me, and I see you, and I think you're the most wonderful little girl in the whole world." Emma's arms tightened around Maria's neck, and in that moment, the bond between them felt stronger than any legal document or employment contract. They were choosing each other, creating family through love rather than obligation, building something real and lasting despite the circumstances that had brought them together. But even as Maria offered this comfort to Emma, she was painfully aware of how fragile their situation remained. Jonathan's increasing isolation and business stress, combined with his obvious resentment of what he saw as Maria's divided loyalties, created a volatile environment that could explode at any moment. Maria lived with the constant fear that she might come to work one day to find herself dismissed, separated from Emma without warning or preparation, leaving the child to navigate her father's emotional unavailability alone. The fear wasn't paranoia. It was based on realistic assessment of her powerless position and Jonathan's demonstrated willingness to prioritize his convenience over Emma's emotional well-being. Maria had seen other domestic workers dismissed without notice for minor infractions or personality conflicts, had heard stories of nannies who formed deep bonds with children only to be suddenly cut off when family circumstances changed. The vulnerability of her position was a source of constant anxiety that she had to hide from Emma while managing her own growing dread about their future together. As winter deepened over Manhattan and the holiday season approached, Maria threw herself into creating special memories with Emma, as if she could somehow immunize their relationship against future separation by making their present moments magical enough to last forever. She taught Emma traditional Christmas songs in Spanish, helped her make gifts for her classmates, and planned special outings to see the city's holiday decorations. Every activity was infused with extra tenderness, extra attention, as though Maria was trying to pour a lifetime of love into whatever time they had left together. Jonathan's absence during this holiday season was more pronounced than ever. Business dinners and emergency meetings kept him away from home most evenings, and even when he was physically present, his mind was clearly elsewhere. Emma's excitement about Christmas decorations and school performances went largely unnoticed, leaving Maria to serve as both audience and cheerleader for the child's seasonal enthusiasms. The imbalance in Emma's life, unlimited material resources but limited emotional support from her father, became more stark during the holidays when other children were excited about family traditions and special time with parents. Emma's disappointment when Jonathan missed her school's Christmas concert, her quiet resignation when he forgot to ask about her holiday wish list, her brave attempts to interest him in activities that brought other fathers and daughters together. All of it broke Maria's heart while strengthening her resolve to be the constant, loving presence that Emma could count on. But the pressure of serving as Emma's primary source of emotional support while maintaining the fiction that she was merely an employee was taking its toll on Maria's own well-being. The love she felt for Emma was as deep and complex as any mother's love, but it existed without recognition, security, or official standing. She worried about Emma's future, grieved over the child's unmet needs, celebrated Emma's achievements with pride that had no outlet or acknowledgement. The emotional labor of loving so deeply while remaining officially invisible was exhausting in ways that Maria struggled to articulate even to herself. During quiet moments when Emma was at school and the penthouse was empty except for her own presence, Maria would sometimes allow herself to imagine different scenarios. What if circumstances had brought her and Emma together as family rather than as employee and employer's daughter? What if she had legal standing to advocate for Emma's best interests? What if her years of devotion and care had created rights rather than just responsibilities? These fantasies provided brief comfort, but also highlighted the painful gap between the emotional reality of their relationship and its legal status. The approaching new year felt ominous to Maria, laden with uncertainty about what changes might come and how they might affect her ability to continue loving and caring for Emma. Jonathan's business problems showed no signs of improvement, and his mood remained unpredictable and often harsh. The household staff had begun whispering about potential layoffs, about the family cutting expenses, about changes that might be coming as the Remingtons adjusted to their altered financial circumstances. Maria tried to prepare herself mentally for various possibilities, while continuing to provide Emma with the stability and love that remained the most important constants in the child's life. Whatever happened, Maria was determined to protect Emma from adult anxieties and power struggles, to continue being the source of unconditional love that every child deserves, regardless of how tenuous her position might become. The stage was being set for confrontations and revelations that would test every bond, every assumption, every carefully maintained balance in the Remington household. Maria's love for Emma would soon be challenged not just by Jonathan's authority, but by forces beyond anyone's control. Circumstances that would reveal the true nature of family loyalty and the real price of love that exists without legal protection or social recognition. In the quiet moments before the storm, as Maria continued her nightly journal entries and Emma slept peacefully in her room, surrounded by luxury but anchored by love, neither of them could imagine how dramatically their world was about to change, or how the bonds they had built would be tested by crises that would strip away everything except what truly mattered between two hearts that had chosen each other across all the barriers that society had built to keep them apart. The transformation began on a Tuesday morning in late January, when the city was locked in the grip of a winter storm that had blanketed Manhattan in over a foot of snow. The unusual weather had disrupted normal schedules throughout the city, closing schools and making transportation difficult. Emma was home for what would normally have been a school day, and Jonathan was working from his study since getting to his office would have been nearly impossible. Maria had planned to use the unexpected snow day as an opportunity for Emma to experience some of the simple joys that wealthy children often missed. Building snowmen in Central Park, making hot chocolate from scratch, watching the city transform into a winter wonderland. But as she prepared breakfast and listened to the weather reports, she noticed that Emma seemed unusually listless and complained of feeling tired. At first, Maria attributed Emma's subdued mood to the disruption in routine and the excitement of the unexpected day off from school. But as the morning progressed, Emma's energy continued to flag, and she began showing signs that made Maria's nursing instincts alert with concern. The child felt warm to the touch, was unusually quiet, and seemed to be having difficulty focusing on activities that normally captured her attention. By noon, Emma's temperature had risen to a fever that couldn't be dismissed as minor. Maria called Jonathan from his study to report that Emma was sick and might need medical attention. His response was characteristically pragmatic. Give her some children's fever reducer and monitor the situation. If it got worse, they could call the family physician. His tone suggested that he viewed childhood illness as just another minor inconvenience that competent staff should be able to handle without disrupting his work schedule. But Maria's experience caring for her late husband during his illness had taught her to trust her instincts when someone she loved showed signs of being unwell. Something about Emma's symptoms, the particular combination of fever, lethargy, and subtle changes in her breathing pattern, triggered alarm bells that went beyond routine childhood illness. She made the decision to monitor Emma more closely than Jonathan's casual response suggested was necessary. As the afternoon wore on, Emma's condition deteriorated rather than improved. Her fever climbed despite the medication, and she began complaining of stomach pain and nausea. Most concerning to Maria was a rash that began appearing on Emma's arms and chest, small red spots that seemed to be spreading as the hours passed. Maria's nursing background helped her recognize that this combination of symptoms could indicate something more serious than a common cold or flu. When Maria tried to get Jonathan's attention for the second time, explaining that Emma's symptoms were worsening and that she was concerned about the rash, she was met with impatience and dismissal. Jonathan was dealing with what he described as urgent business matters, conference calls that couldn't be postponed even for a storm day, financial crises that required his immediate attention. From his perspective, Maria was interrupting important work to report ordinary childhood illness that should be well within her competency to handle. "Maria, you've been taking care of Emma for 6 years," he said with obvious irritation. "Surely you can manage a sick child without constant supervision from me. That's what I pay you for." The dismissive tone and the emphasis on payment rather than parental concern struck Maria as particularly cruel given Emma's obvious distress. But more importantly, it left her in the difficult position of making medical decisions for a child who wasn't legally hers, while the child's actual parent refused to take the situation seriously. By evening, Emma was clearly very sick. Her fever had spiked to dangerous levels, the rash had spread across most of her body, and she was having episodes of vomiting that left her weak and dehydrated. Maria had been sponging Emma with cool water, encouraging her to sip fluids and monitoring her vital signs with growing alarm. The child's eyes had a glazed quality that scared Maria, and Emma's usually bright personality had been replaced by a listless confusion that suggested she was becoming seriously ill. When Maria made her third attempt to get Jonathan to take the situation seriously, she found him still barricaded in his study, surrounded by financial documents and engaged in what sounded like a heated phone conversation about cryptocurrency investments and margin calls. The juxtaposition of his focus on business concerns while his daughter grew sicker in the next room filled Maria with a anger that she struggled to keep professional. "Mr. Remington," she said firmly, interrupting his phone call despite the breach of protocol. "Emma needs to see a doctor immediately. Her fever is very high, and she has symptoms that concern me." Jonathan's response revealed both his priorities and his fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening. "Can't you see I'm dealing with a financial emergency here? I could lose millions if these positions collapse. Give Emma some more medicine and let me handle this crisis." The words hung in the air like a revelation of character, exposing Jonathan's inability to recognize that the most important crisis in his household that night had nothing to do with stock prices or investment portfolios. His daughter was seriously ill, but his attention remained focused on preserving wealth rather than protecting the child who should have been his greatest treasure. Maria made a decision that would later be seen as both professionally insubordinate and personally heroic. Without Jonathan's permission or approval, she called 911 to request emergency medical services for Emma. The child's symptoms had progressed to the point where Maria's nursing experience told her that home care was insufficient, that Emma needed professional medical evaluation and treatment that couldn't be delayed for her father's convenience. The paramedics who responded to Maria's call took one look at Emma's condition and immediately began preparing her for transport to the hospital. The combination of high fever, widespread rash, and altered consciousness suggested possible meningitis or another serious infection that required urgent medical intervention. Their professional assessment confirmed Maria's instincts. Emma was very sick and needed immediate hospital care. It was only when the paramedics were preparing to load Emma into the ambulance that Jonathan finally emerged from his study, alerted by the commotion of emergency personnel in his home. His initial reaction was anger at Maria for calling 911 without his authorization, but that anger quickly transformed into panic as he realized how sick his daughter actually was. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens, medical equipment, and Emma's weak voice calling for Maria rather than her father. The paramedics worked to stabilize Emma's vital signs while Maria held the child's hand, offering comfort and reassurance during the terrifying journey. Jonathan followed in his car, finally forced to confront the reality that his daughter's health crisis was far more serious than the financial crisis he had been prioritizing all day. At the hospital, Emma was immediately admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit, where she was diagnosed with bacterial meningitis, a potentially life-threatening infection that could cause permanent neurological damage or death if not treated aggressively. The medical team explained that Maria's decision to call for emergency services had likely saved Emma's life, that the delay caused by trying to treat her symptoms at home could have had catastrophic consequences. During the critical first hours of Emma's hospitalization, as she fought the infection with the help of powerful antibiotics and round-the-clock medical monitoring, Maria never left her side. She held Emma's hand during painful procedures, sang softly to her when she was frightened, and provided the maternal comfort that the medical staff recognized as essential to the child's emotional well-being during her recovery. Jonathan, meanwhile, struggled to process both his daughter's medical crisis and his own failure to recognize its severity. The business problems that had consumed his attention all day suddenly seemed trivial compared to the possibility of losing Emma. The financial losses that had kept him chained to his study paled in comparison to the potential loss of his child, revealing to him, perhaps for the first time, what actually mattered most in his life. As Emma slowly began to respond to treatment over the next several days, improving gradually but steadily under the careful attention of the hospital staff, Jonathan found himself observing Maria with new awareness. He watched her maintain a constant vigil beside Emma's hospital bed, saw how naturally she provided comfort and advocacy for his daughter, witnessed the obvious love and connection between them that he had somehow failed to fully appreciate during their years together. The hospital staff treated Maria as Emma's mother in all but name, naturally turning to her for information about the child's medical history, seeking her input on treatment decisions, recognizing her as the primary source of emotional support that Emma needed for healing. Their assumption that Maria was family rather than employee highlighted the gap between legal relationships and emotional reality, revealing how thoroughly Maria had earned her place as the most important person in Emma's life. For Jonathan, Watching this dynamic unfold was both humbling and enlightening. He began to see his own absence more clearly, not just his physical absence from Emma's daily life, but his emotional absence from her inner world. Maria knew Emma's fears and preferences, her sources of comfort and joy, her developmental needs and personality quirks. She was fluent in the language of Emma's heart in ways that Jonathan realized he had never learned, despite being her biological father. The week Emma spent in the hospital became a turning point in all their relationships. Emma's recovery was steady but slow, requiring patience and careful attention to her changing needs as the infection was brought under control and her strength gradually returned. Maria never wavered in her dedication, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside Emma's bed, advocating with nurses and doctors on the child's behalf, maintaining the loving presence that anchored Emma's world, even in the unfamiliar and frightening hospital environment. Jonathan found himself spending more time at the hospital than he had ever spent focused solely on his daughter's needs. With his business concerns temporarily set aside by the medical emergency, he was able to observe the relationship between Maria and Emma without the distractions that usually consumed his attention. What he saw was a bond of mutual love and trust that had been built over years of shared experiences, daily care, and emotional connection. He watched Maria help Emma through painful IV changes with a combination of firmness and gentleness that eased the child's fear. He observed how Emma's eyes followed Maria around the room, how she relaxed when Maria was near, how she naturally turned to Maria for comfort and reassurance. He listened to their quiet conversations, hearing the easy intimacy of two people who knew each other deeply, who shared inside jokes and private understandings that spoke of a relationship built on time, attention, and genuine care. For the first time in years, Jonathan also had extended conversations with Emma without the buffer of other activities or competing demands on his attention. Sitting beside her hospital bed during the long hours of her recovery, he was able to focus entirely on his daughter, listening to her thoughts and feelings, responding to her questions and concerns, beginning to build the kind of emotional connection that had somehow gotten lost in the complexity of his adult responsibilities. Emma, still weak from her illness but emotionally responsive to this unusual attention from her father, began to open up to him in ways she had rarely done before. She shared her feelings about being sick, her appreciation for Maria's constant care, her hopes for when she could return home and to school. These conversations revealed to Jonathan how articulate and thoughtful his daughter was, how much depth and personality existed beneath the surface of daily routines he had largely ignored. But even as Jonathan began to develop a deeper relationship with Emma, he also became increasingly aware of how central Maria was to his daughter's sense of security and well-being. Emma's recovery was aided not just by medical treatment but by Maria's emotional support, her advocacy with hospital staff, her ability to make even the sterile hospital environment feel safer and more caring through her presence. The nursing staff regularly commented on how fortunate Emma was to have such a devoted caregiver, how Maria's presence was clearly contributing to the child's healing process. These professional observations reinforced what Jonathan was beginning to understand, that Maria's role in Emma's life went far beyond the job description he had originally imagined, that she had become essential to his daughter's emotional development and psychological well-being. As Emma's hospital stay drew to a close and discharge planning began, Jonathan faced a decision about how to acknowledge what had happened and what it revealed about his family's dynamics. Maria's quick thinking and medical knowledge had quite literally saved Emma's life, while his own priorities and attention had nearly cost his daughter her health or even her life. The contrast between Maria's protective instincts and his own distracted indifference was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. The financial crisis that had seemed so urgent on the day Emma became sick was still present, but Jonathan's perspective on its importance had been permanently altered. The possibility of losing money, even substantial amounts of money, simply couldn't compare to the possibility of losing his child. The fear he had experienced during Emma's hospitalization, the terror of imagining life without her, had reminded him of what actually mattered in his life and what was merely circumstantial. On the day of Emma's discharge from the hospital, Jonathan made the first of several gestures that marked a fundamental shift in how he viewed both his daughter and the woman who had been caring for her. Instead of the perfunctory thanks that Maria might have expected for her professional competence during a medical emergency, Jonathan offered both genuine gratitude and a substantial financial bonus that reflected his understanding of how much he owed her. But more importantly, he began making changes in his daily routine that prioritized time with Emma over business calls and financial concerns. The near loss of his daughter had reminded him that no amount of wealth could compensate for missing her childhood, that the investment portfolio that had consumed his thoughts could never provide him with the kind of returns that came from actually knowing and loving his daughter as she grew and developed. Emma's recovery at home was gradual but steady, aided by Maria's continued care and now supplemented by Jonathan's increased attention and involvement. The child seemed to bloom under this combination of loving care from both adults, her natural resilience and joy returning as she regained her strength and health. The frightening hospital experience had left her more aware of how much she valued both Maria's devotion and her father's love, and she seemed determined to enjoy both to the fullest. For Maria, the aftermath of Emma's illness brought a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt profound relief and gratitude that Emma had recovered fully, that her decision to call for emergency help had been vindicated, that the child she loved was healthy and safe. On the other hand, Jonathan's newfound appreciation for her role in Emma's life, while gratifying, also highlighted how invisible and undervalued her contributions had been for so many years. The recognition felt both validating and bittersweet. Wonderful to finally be seen and appreciated, but painful to realize how much of her devotion had previously gone unnoticed. The 6 years she had spent loving and caring for Emma without acknowledgement couldn't be retroactively recognized, and the emotional toll of feeling invisible for so long couldn't be easily healed by even the most sincere gratitude expressed after the fact. But what mattered most to Maria was that Emma was healthy and that their relationship could continue without the cloud of uncertainty that had been hanging over their future. Jonathan's changed attitude suggested that her position in the household was more secure, that her value to the family was finally understood and appreciated. For someone whose greatest fear had been losing the child she loved, this security felt like the most precious gift she could have received. As spring arrived in Manhattan and Emma returned to her normal activities, school, playdates, weekend outings with Maria, the household settled into new rhythms that reflected the lessons learned during the crisis. Jonathan made genuine efforts to be more present in Emma's daily life, joining them for breakfast when possible, asking about Emma's school day, participating in weekend activities that had previously been Maria's sole responsibility. This increased paternal involvement didn't diminish Emma's bond with Maria. Instead, it enriched the child's life by giving her access to love and attention from multiple sources. Emma thrived under this expanded attention, her natural exuberance and curiosity returning fully as she felt securely loved by both the adults who mattered most in her life. For Maria, watching Jonathan develop a closer relationship with Emma brought its own form of satisfaction. She had always believed that Emma deserved her father's love and attention, and seeing that relationship begin to flourish felt like another form of success in her caregiving role. Her goal had never been to replace Jonathan as Emma's parent, but to provide the child with the love and stability she needed while hoping that his own parental instincts might eventually awaken. The crisis had revealed character in all of them: Emma's resilience and capacity for love, Maria's protective instincts and professional competence, Jonathan's capacity for growth and change when confronted with what really mattered. The relationships between all three had been transformed by the experience, creating a new family dynamic that honored both blood connections and chosen bonds. But even as this new stability took hold and the Remington household found its improved rhythm, Maria remained aware that their situation, while better, was still fundamentally built on the same power imbalances that had always defined her position. She was still an employee rather than family, still vulnerable to decisions made by Jonathan that could disrupt her relationship with Emma, still loving across barriers that legal and social structures maintained. The security she felt was real but conditional, dependent on Jonathan's continued appreciation and Emma's ongoing need for her care. As much as the medical crisis had revealed Maria's importance to the family, it had also highlighted her powerlessness within it. She could save Emma's life, but she couldn't protect her own position without Jonathan's goodwill and recognition. These underlying tensions would soon be tested in ways that none of them anticipated, as new challenges emerged that would reveal whether the changes in their relationships were permanent or merely temporary responses to crisis. The foundation of trust and appreciation that had been built during Emma's illness would soon face pressures that would determine whether gratitude could overcome the structural inequalities that still defined their situation. The return to normal life after a medical crisis often brings with it a settling back into familiar patterns, and as the months passed following Emma's recovery, certain dynamics in the Remington household began to shift back toward their previous configurations. Jonathan's business concerns, temporarily set aside during his daughter's hospitalization, reasserted themselves as urgent priorities that demanded increasing amounts of his time and attention. The cryptocurrency market, which had been volatile during the previous year, experienced dramatic swings that threatened substantial portions of Jonathan's portfolio. Bitcoin investments that had once seemed like guaranteed paths to even greater wealth were now sources of stress and financial exposure that required careful management. The hedge fund he managed was under pressure from investors who were questioning his judgment and demanding better returns on their capital. These professional pressures began to erode some of the personal growth that Jonathan had experienced during Emma's illness. The clarity about what mattered most, the certainty that Emma's health and happiness were more important than any financial consideration, started to blur as the immediate fear of losing her faded and was replaced by more familiar anxieties about maintaining his position in the competitive world of high finance. Maria watched these changes with growing concern, recognizing the patterns that had characterized the household dynamics before Emma's illness. Jonathan's breakfast appearances became less frequent, his attention during the time he spent at home became more scattered, and his patience with domestic concerns grew shorter as business pressures intensified. But what worried Maria most was how these changes were affecting Emma. The child had thrived during the period when she had access to both Maria's consistent care and her father's increased attention. Having experienced what it felt like to be truly seen and valued by both important adults in her life, Emma was now struggling with her father's gradual return to distance and distraction. Emma's questions about why Daddy was working so much again, why he couldn't come to her school performance, why he seemed upset when she tried to share excitement about her day. These became daily challenges for Maria to navigate. She wanted to protect Emma from disappointment while also honoring the child's need to understand her father's behavior and maintain hope for his attention and affection. The delicate balance Maria tried to maintain, supporting Jonathan's parental authority while advocating for Emma's emotional needs, became increasingly difficult as Jonathan's availability and patience with family matters diminished. The gratitude he had expressed for Maria's care during the medical crisis began to feel more like a distant memory than a foundation for ongoing appreciation. During this period of shifting dynamics, an event occurred that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of all their relationships. Jonathan's business problems, which had been simmering at a manageable level for months, suddenly escalated into a full crisis that threatened not just his financial stability, but his personal and professional reputation. A federal investigation into some of his investment practices had uncovered what regulators claimed were violations of securities laws, potentially involving fraudulent representations to investors about the risks and returns of certain cryptocurrency transactions. The allegations were serious enough to warrant criminal charges, and the media attention surrounding the case was intense and damaging to both Jonathan's business and his social standing. The stress of facing potential criminal prosecution, devastating financial losses, and public humiliation pushed Jonathan into a state of crisis that made his previous business concerns seem trivial by comparison. His behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, alternating between periods of frantic activity and periods of withdrawal, between bursts of anger and episodes of what appeared to be depression. For Emma, living in a household where the primary adult was consumed by fears and pressures she couldn't understand, became another source of instability and anxiety. Her father's mood swings were frightening to a child who was still recovering emotionally from her serious illness, and his inability to maintain normal routines or show consistent affection left her feeling insecure and confused. Maria found herself serving as the sole source of stability in Emma's life during this chaotic period, working to maintain normal routines and emotional security for the child, while the adult world around them spiraled into crisis. She took on increased responsibilities for managing Emma's daily needs, school relationships, and emotional well-being, essentially functioning as a single parent while Jonathan struggled with his legal and financial problems. But Maria's expanded role during this crisis was neither officially recognized nor adequately compensated. She was expected to manage increased responsibilities with the same job description and salary she had always received, even as the demands on her time and emotional energy grew exponentially. The situation highlighted once again how her essential contributions to the family were taken for granted rather than valued appropriately. The investigation into Jonathan's business practices continued for several months, during which time the family's financial situation became increasingly precarious. Assets were frozen pending the investigation, income streams were disrupted, and legal expenses mounted rapidly. The lifestyle that had seemed unshakably secure began to show signs of strain, though the changes were subtle and primarily visible to someone like Maria, who managed the household's daily operations. During this period of uncertainty and stress, Emma began showing signs of the psychological pressure she was experiencing. Her academic performance at school declined, she had difficulty sleeping, and she became more clingy and anxious in her interactions with Maria. The child was clearly struggling to understand why her world had become so unpredictable, and why her father seemed constantly upset and unavailable. Maria did everything in her power to shield Emma from the adult anxieties that were consuming the household, maintaining cheerful routines and providing extra attention and comfort to help the child cope with the stress she couldn't fully understand. But the emotional labor of caring for a traumatized child, while managing her own fears about job security and family stability, was exhausting Maria in ways that she struggled to manage alone. The isolation that had always characterized Maria's position in the household became even more pronounced during this crisis period. She had no one with whom she could share her concerns about Emma's well-being or her own worries about what the family's legal and financial problems might mean for her future. The other household staff were focused on their own job security, and Jonathan was too consumed with his legal troubles to be available for conversations about Emma's emotional needs. As the federal investigation reached its conclusion, the outcome was both better and worse than anyone had anticipated. The criminal charges were dropped in exchange for Jonathan's cooperation with the investigation and payment of substantial fines and restitution. He would avoid prison, but the financial penalties and legal costs had devastated his personal wealth and essentially destroyed his career in finance. The resolution of the legal case brought relief from the fear of imprisonment, but it also brought new challenges related to the family's dramatically altered financial situation. The penthouse would have to be sold, along with other properties and assets, to pay legal fees and satisfy regulatory penalties. Jonathan's income prospects were limited given his damaged reputation in the financial industry, and the family would need to adjust to a much more modest lifestyle. For Emma, the news that they would be moving out of the only home she remembered, leaving behind her school and friends, adjusting to an uncertain future, with a father whose confidence and authority had been shattered by his legal troubles, was devastating. The child who had already endured her mother's death, a serious illness, and months of household instability was now facing another major disruption that threatened to uproot everything familiar in her life. But what worried Emma most was what these changes might mean for her relationship with Maria. If the family could no longer afford their current lifestyle, would that mean they could no longer afford to keep Maria as her caregiver? The possibility of losing the one stable, loving relationship in her life was terrifying to Emma, and she began asking increasingly anxious questions about whether Maria would be coming with them to whatever new home they would have. Maria herself was wondering the same thing. Jonathan's financial situation was now so changed that maintaining a full-time nanny might no longer be feasible, especially given that they would be moving to a smaller home in a less expensive neighborhood where Maria's services might seem less necessary. The job security that had felt more solid after Emma's illness was now threatened by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The conversations about the family's future living arrangements were awkward and uncomfortable, with Jonathan struggling to maintain his authority and dignity while acknowledging that they would need to make significant lifestyle changes. Maria was included in some of these discussions, as practical matters required her input, but her own future with the family remained uncertain and unaddressed. As the details of their relocation were finalized, it became clear that the family would be moving to a modest house in Queens, a dramatic change from the Manhattan penthouse, but still within Maria's ability to commute if her services were retained. The house was near Maria's own neighborhood, which seemed symbolically significant in ways that no one explicitly acknowledged, as if the family was moving closer to Maria's world, rather than expecting her to continue navigating theirs. The decision about whether Maria would continue working for the family was postponed until after the move, adding to the uncertainty and stress that all of them were experiencing. Emma's anxiety about potentially losing Maria became acute, affecting her sleep, her appetite, and her ability to focus on the practical tasks of packing and preparing for their transition. During the final weeks in the penthouse, as movers packed away the luxurious artifacts of their former life, Maria found herself in the strange position of dismantling a household that had been her workplace for 6 years, while not knowing if she would be part of whatever new family structure emerged from this transition. The emotional weight of potentially saying goodbye to Emma, combined with the practical uncertainty about her own future employment, created a stress that Maria struggled to hide from the child who needed her to appear stable and confident. The actual move was emotionally wrenching for all of them, but especially for Emma, who cried as they drove away from the penthouse for the last time. The building had been her home for her entire conscious life, the backdrop for all her memories with Maria, the place where she had grown from a toddler to a school-age child. Leaving it behind felt like abandoning another piece of her identity, another connection to stability and familiarity. The house in Queens was pleasant but modest, with none of the marble grandeur or dramatic city views that had characterized their previous life. For Emma, the smaller spaces and more ordinary surroundings felt diminished rather than cozy, a visible reminder of all that had been lost due to her father's legal troubles. The child struggled to adjust to her new room, her new neighborhood, the new elementary school where she would finish the academic year. But what provided continuity for Emma during this difficult transition was Maria's presence and love. Despite the uncertainty about employment arrangements, Maria continued caring for Emma through the move, helping her adjust to new routines and environments, providing the emotional stability that made all the other changes bearable. Their relationship remained the constant that anchored Emma's world, even as everything else shifted around them. For Jonathan, the move to Queens represented not just a change of address, but a fundamental alteration in his identity and social status. The man who had once commanded respect in Manhattan's financial circles was now living in a modest neighborhood, his career destroyed, his wealth depleted, his confidence shattered. The adjustment was painful and disorienting, made more difficult by his awareness that his daughter was observing his struggle and learning lessons about resilience, failure, and recovery that he wasn't sure he was qualified to teach. In this new environment, Maria's value to the family became even more apparent. Her familiarity with the neighborhood, her comfort with a more modest lifestyle, her ability to help Emma adjust to their changed circumstances, all of these made her essential in ways that went beyond her traditional caregiving duties. She became a bridge between their old life and their new reality, helping all of them navigate the practical and emotional challenges of their transition. The question of whether the family could afford to keep Maria as an employee was eventually resolved through a conversation that acknowledged both their financial constraints and their emotional needs. Jonathan proposed a modified arrangement that reduced Maria's salary, but maintained her position as Emma's caregiver, recognizing that losing Maria would compound Emma's trauma and his own inability to provide adequate emotional support during such a difficult period. Maria accepted the reduced compensation because her attachment to Emma transcended financial considerations, though the pay cut created new challenges for her own financial security. The job that had once provided comfortable stability now required her to carefully budget and perhaps even seek supplemental income to maintain her modest apartment and support the family members in Puerto Rico who depended on her occasional assistance. But what mattered most to Maria was that she could continue loving and caring for Emma during this vulnerable period in the child's life. The continuity of their relationship provided both of them with something precious that couldn't be measured in salary terms, the security of unconditional love and mutual commitment that transcended external circumstances. As they settled into their new life in Queens, the dynamics of the Remington household continued to evolve in response to their changed circumstances. Jonathan's humility and vulnerability, forced upon him by his legal and financial troubles, actually made him more accessible to Emma in some ways. Without the armor of wealth and professional success, he was more human-scaled, more capable of connecting with his daughter's emotional needs and daily concerns. Emma's adjustment to their new circumstances was gradual but ultimately positive. Aided by Maria's consistent support and her father's increased emotional availability, the child learned important lessons about resilience, about finding happiness that wasn't dependent on material luxury, about the difference between having money and being rich in the things that actually mattered. For Maria, the period after their move became one of the most rewarding phases of her employment with the family, even though it was also one of the most challenging financially. The artificial barriers that wealth and social status had created were gone, allowing for more authentic relationships between all of them. Emma's gratitude for continuity in her relationship with Maria was openly expressed. Jonathan's appreciation for Maria's loyalty during difficult times was genuine and heartfelt. And Maria herself felt more seen and valued than she had in years. The new house became a home in ways that the penthouse never had, filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter rather than the echoes of emptiness and emotional distance. Emma thrived in the more intimate environment, her natural exuberance returning as she felt securely loved by both adults and more connected to the neighborhood and school communities that were now part of her daily life. As months passed and the new routines became established, it became clear that the financial crisis that had seemed so devastating had actually created opportunities for growth and connection that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The family's relationships were stronger, more honest, and more mutually supportive than they had been during their years of material success but emotional poverty. Maria's role in facilitating this healing and growth was obvious to everyone involved. Her steady presence during the crisis, her skill in helping Emma adjust to change, her loyalty despite reduced compensation. All of these demonstrated the kind of character and commitment that couldn't be purchased, but had been freely given out of love. The family's acknowledgement of her contributions felt different now, more genuine and less patronizing than the occasional gratitude she had received during their wealthier period. Yet, even as their relationships deepened and became more authentic, Maria remained aware that her position was still fundamentally that of an employee rather than family member. The love between her and Emma was real and mutual. Her importance to the family's emotional well-being was recognized and valued, but the legal and social structures that defined their situation remained unchanged. This awareness became particularly sharp when Emma began asking questions about their future together, whether Maria would always be part of their lives, what would happen when Emma grew up and no longer needed a nanny. The child's anxiety about potentially losing Maria revealed how central their relationship had become to her sense of security and identity, but it also highlighted the impermanence that still characterized Maria's position in their family structure. Jonathan, observing these conversations and recognizing both Emma's deep attachment to Maria and Maria's essential role in their household's emotional health, began to consider whether there might be ways to provide more security and recognition for the woman who had become so central to their lives. But the legal and practical complexities of creating family-like bonds while maintaining employer-employee relationships were challenging to navigate, especially given their reduced financial resources and changed social status. The question of how to honor and protect relationships that transcended traditional employment categories would become increasingly important as Emma grew older and more aware of social structures and legal realities. The love between Maria and Emma was as deep and lasting as any mother-daughter bond, but it existed without the legal protections and social recognition that blood relationships enjoyed. As they entered their second year in the Queen's house, all three of them had been transformed by their experiences of crisis, loss, adjustment, and recovery. Emma had learned resilience and maintained her capacity for joy despite multiple traumas. Jonathan had discovered humility and developed genuine rather than performative parenting skills. Maria had continued loving faithfully through uncertainty and change, proving that her commitment to Emma transcended external circumstances. But the fundamental tensions in their situation, the gap between emotional reality and legal status, the vulnerability of relationships built on employment rather than kinship, the challenge of sustaining love across power imbalances remained unresolved. These tensions would continue to shape their interactions and influence their future decisions as Emma grew older and became more aware of the complexities that defined her relationship with the woman who had raised her. The story of their continued evolution, the ways they would navigate Emma's adolescence and young adulthood, the eventual resolution of questions about security, recognition, and permanence, all of this remained to be written as they continued building their unconventional but deeply loving family in their modest Queen's home, surrounded by authentic wealth that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with chosen bonds that had survived every test. The resolution of their immediate housing and employment crisis had brought a kind of peace to the household that allowed deeper healing to begin. Emma, now 8 years old, was thriving in her new school and had made friends in the neighborhood. Her resilience and adaptability had impressed her teachers, who noted that despite all the upheaval in her life, she remained a kind, curious, and emotionally intelligent child who showed unusual empathy for others facing difficulties. Jonathan had found work with a small investment firm that specialized in ethical financial planning for middle-class families, a dramatic shift from his previous high-stakes hedge fund work, but one that allowed him to use his expertise in service of ordinary people rather than ultra-wealthy clients. The job paid modestly, but provided satisfaction that his previous career had never offered. He came home each evening genuinely interested in sharing dinner with Emma and Maria, rather than viewing family time as an interruption of more important business. For Maria, This period represented the first time in her years with the family that she felt truly integrated into their daily life, rather than orbiting around it as help. The smaller house meant more shared spaces and informal interactions. The reduced financial pressure meant fewer status concerns and social pretensions. The family's increased emotional openness meant that her contributions were acknowledged and her presence was celebrated rather than simply expected. One evening in late fall, as they sat around the kitchen table after dinner, a scene that would have been unimaginable during their penthouse years, Emma made an announcement that surprised both adults. "I'm writing a story for school about my family," she said, looking up from her notebook. "It's about the three most important people in my life, and I'm calling it My Dad, My Maria, and Me." The casual way Emma included Maria as family, the matter-of-fact assumption that their household consisted of three people who belonged together, revealed how completely the child had integrated Maria into her understanding of kinship and love. For Emma, the question wasn't whether Maria was family. That was obvious. The question was why the adult world seemed to have such complicated rules about who qualified as real family and who didn't. Jonathan found himself deeply moved by Emma's simple acceptance of their unusual family structure. His daughter's wisdom about what created real family bonds, time, care, loyalty, love, stood in sharp contrast to his own years of focusing on legal and financial definitions of family that had obscured what actually mattered in building human connections. Maria felt simultaneously validated and vulnerable, hearing Emma's easy classification of their relationship. The child's love and acceptance were the greatest gifts Maria had ever received, but they also highlighted how much she had to lose if circumstances ever separated them. Being acknowledged as family by Emma meant everything to Maria, but it also increased her awareness of how unofficial and unprotected that family status remained. "Tell me about your story," Maria said gently, encouraging Emma to share more about her creative project, while also learning about how the child understood their relationship and its place in her life. Emma's story, as she read portions aloud, was a celebration of ordinary moments that had created extraordinary bonds. She wrote about Maria teaching her to speak Spanish, about Jonathan learning to braid her hair after they moved to Queens, about family movie nights where all three of them would curl up on the couch together. Her narrative revealed a child who had learned to find magic in simple domestic moments rather than expensive entertainments. But Emma's story also included references to before and after, before her illness, before they moved, before her daddy learned to be home for dinner. The child's understanding that their family had evolved and improved over time showed remarkable emotional sophistication and suggested that she valued their current closeness even more because she remembered when it hadn't existed. As Emma worked on her story over several weeks, she would share sections with both adults and ask for their input on details she wanted to include. These conversations became opportunities for all three of them to reflect on their shared history, to acknowledge how much they had grown and changed, to express appreciation for the bonds they had built together. Jonathan found himself thinking about his own childhood, his parents' distant and formal parenting style, the wealth that had provided material security but emotional poverty. Emma's story reminded him that his daughter was experiencing something he had never received, the daily presence of adults who genuinely enjoyed her company, who were interested in her thoughts and feelings, who celebrated her existence rather than simply providing for her physical needs. Maria was struck by how Emma's narrative emphasized moments of care and connection rather than material circumstances. The child's happiest memories weren't about expensive toys or exotic vacations, but about bedtime stories, shared meals, walks in the park, and the security of knowing she was loved. The story validated Maria's approach to childcare, which had always prioritized emotional connection over educational enrichment or social advancement. When Emma finished her story and presented it at school, Her teacher was so impressed that she asked if Emma would be willing to read it aloud at a school assembly about family diversity. Emma proudly agreed, excited to share her story with a larger audience and to represent families that might look different from traditional nuclear units, but were held together by love and commitment. The school assembly was Maria's first experience being publicly acknowledged as part of Emma's family. As Emma read her story aloud, describing Maria as my Spanish teacher, my best friend, and my second mom all in one person, Maria felt tears streaming down her face. Here, in front of Emma's classmates, teachers, and other parents, the child was proudly claiming their relationship and defining it as a form of family that deserved recognition and respect. After the assembly, several other parents approached Maria to express their admiration for Emma's story and to share their own experiences with non-traditional family structures. These conversations provided Maria with a sense of community she had rarely experienced, connecting her with other adults who understood the complexity and beauty of families built on choice rather than biology. The positive response to Emma's story also gave Jonathan new perspective on how their family appeared to outsiders. He realized that other people saw Maria's devotion to Emma and his own gratitude for her presence as evidence of a successful family unit that worked because all three members contributed to each other's well-being. The judgment he had feared about their unconventional arrangement was largely absent. Instead, people seemed to admire their ability to create stability and love despite challenging circumstances. As winter approached and Emma's 9th birthday drew near, the family began planning a celebration that would reflect their current values and circumstances rather than trying to recreate the elaborate parties of their wealthier past. Emma requested a simple party at home with a few neighborhood friends, homemade cake, and the kind of warm, intimate celebration that their new lifestyle had made possible. Maria took charge of most of the party planning, working with Emma to choose decorations, plan activities, and prepare food that would make the celebration special without being expensive or elaborate. The collaboration gave both of them great joy, representing the kind of partnership that Maria had always hoped to have with Emma, but that had been more difficult in their previous living situation. Jonathan contributed to the party planning in ways that demonstrated his continued growth as a father. He helped Emma design invitations, learned to bake a birthday cake under Maria's instruction, and planned simple party games that would entertain children without requiring expensive equipment or elaborate setups. His participation was hands-on and enthusiastic rather than merely financial, showing Emma that celebrations could be meaningful without being costly. The day of Emma's party was filled with laughter, friendship, and the kind of genuine joy that money couldn't purchase. The children played simple games, enjoyed homemade cake, and participated in activities that emphasized creativity and connection over consumption. Emma glowed with happiness throughout the day, clearly feeling celebrated and loved by the community that had gathered to honor her birthday. For Maria, watching Emma's joy at the party felt like validation of everything she believed about childhood and celebration. The child's friends were having fun with simple pleasures. Emma was radiating confidence and happiness, and the whole event felt warm and authentic rather than performative or showy. The party represented the kind of celebration Maria would have planned for her own child, and being able to create it for Emma felt like a profound gift. As the evening wound down and the last guests went home, Emma threw her arms around both Jonathan and Maria, thanking them for the best birthday ever. Her gratitude was spontaneous and genuine, clearly coming from a child who felt thoroughly loved and celebrated. The success of the party was measured not in dollars spent, but in the joy shared and memories created. Later that evening, as Maria was cleaning up the kitchen and Jonathan was helping Emma organize her birthday gifts, Emma made another one of her unexpectedly profound observations. "Maria," she said, "I think some kids have lots of stuff but not very much love, and I'm lucky because I have lots of love and just the right amount of stuff." The comment revealed Emma's sophisticated understanding of wealth and value, her ability to distinguish between material abundance and emotional richness. Maria felt proud that Emma had learned this wisdom so early, that she had somehow taught the child to recognize and appreciate the difference between having money and being truly rich in the things that mattered. As the months passed and their second year in the Queen's house progressed, the family continued to deepen their bonds and develop new traditions that reflected their evolved values and closer relationships. Sunday family dinners became regular occasions where all three of them would cook together, share stories about their week, and plan activities for the coming days. These meals felt ceremonial in their importance, marking time and celebrating their connections in ways that the formal dinner parties of their penthouse years never had. Emma's academic performance continued to excel, but more importantly, her emotional development showed signs of remarkable maturity and stability. Her teachers noted that she was a natural peacemaker among her classmates, showing unusual ability to empathize with others and help resolve conflicts. These social skills reflected the emotional intelligence she was developing at home, where authentic communication and mutual respect had become the norm. Maria's influence on Emma's character development was obvious to everyone who spent time with the child. Emma's kindness, her appreciation for diversity, her comfort with different social and economic backgrounds, her bilingual abilities, all of these spoke to the broadening influence Maria had provided throughout her upbringing. Emma was becoming a young person who was equally comfortable with wealthy Manhattan families and working-class Queens neighbors, equally fluent in English and Spanish, equally at ease with traditional American customs and Puerto Rican cultural practices. For Jonathan, watching Emma's continued development under Maria's guidance provided ongoing education about parenting and child development. He was learning to see how daily interactions shaped character, how consistent emotional availability built confidence, how authentic relationships created security that allowed children to take appropriate risks and develop independence. These were lessons he had never learned from his own parents or business associates, but they were transforming his approach to fatherhood and his understanding of what success really meant. As Emma's 9th year progressed toward her 10th birthday, the question of their family's future became more complex and important. Emma was approaching an age where she would become increasingly aware of social structures and legal realities, where questions about permanence and security in relationships would become more sophisticated and pressing. The easy acceptance of their family structure that had characterized Emma's younger years might give way to more complicated questions about status, recognition, and long-term stability. Maria found herself thinking about these upcoming challenges while also dealing with her own aging and changing needs. At 54, she was still energetic and capable, but she was also aware that her years of physical labor were taking their toll on her body. The reduced salary she was receiving made it difficult to save adequately for retirement, and she sometimes worried about her own long-term security in ways that had been less pressing when her income was higher. But more than her financial concerns, Maria worried about what would happen to her relationship with Emma as the child grew older and eventually no longer needed daily caregiving. Their bond had been built around Emma's childhood needs, and Maria wasn't sure how it would evolve as Emma became a teenager and young adult with expanding independence and changing priorities. These concerns came to a head during a conversation Maria was having with her sister Rosa during one of their regular phone calls. Rosa, now caring for their elderly mother full-time, was encouraging Maria to consider moving back to Puerto Rico to help with their mother's care and to be closer to extended family as she entered her own later years. "You've given that family everything you have," Rosa argued. "You've raised their child, saved their daughter's life, been loyal through all their troubles. But what do you have to show for it? Where will you be when the girl goes to college? What happens when they don't need you anymore?" The questions were painful because they highlighted the fundamental insecurity that still characterized Maria's position despite all the emotional growth and family bonding that had occurred. She was still legally an employee rather than family, still dependent on Jonathan's goodwill rather than protected by kinship rights, still vulnerable to being dismissed or devalued regardless of her years of service and emotional investment. But the thought of leaving Emma, especially during the child's formative pre-adolescent years, felt impossible to Maria. Their relationship was the most important thing in her life, and she couldn't imagine voluntarily abandoning it, even for the security of living near her own blood relatives. Emma needed her, depended on her, loved her. How could she walk away from such a precious bond? The conversation with Rosa forced Maria to confront questions she had been avoiding about her own future, while also highlighting the complex loyalties that pulled her in different directions. Her obligation to her own family of origin, her love for Emma, her need for financial security, her desire for recognition and respect, all of these created competing demands that were difficult to balance. As Maria struggled with these internal conflicts, an unexpected event occurred that would provide some clarity about her situation, while also creating new challenges for all of them to navigate. Jonathan's former business associates, who had maintained social contact despite his legal troubles and changed circumstances, offered him an opportunity that could significantly improve the family's financial situation, but would require major life changes. A former colleague had started an investment consulting firm in Houston and was offering Jonathan a senior position that would pay substantially more than his current job. The opportunity would allow him to rebuild his career and financial security, providing Emma with better educational opportunities and a more comfortable lifestyle. But taking the job would require the family to relocate to Texas, leaving behind the life they had built in Queens and the community connections that had become important to all of them. The job offer created excitement and anxiety in equal measure. Jonathan was energized by the possibility of professional rehabilitation and financial improvement. Emma was intrigued by the adventure of living somewhere new, and Maria was terrified by the uncertainty about what such a move would mean for her own future with the family. Would Jonathan's improved financial situation lead him to hire a more traditionally credentialed nanny or housekeeper? Would the family's return to greater wealth create social pressures that would make Maria's presence seem inappropriate or embarrassing? Would the distance from her own support network and familiar community make it impossible for her to maintain her modest lifestyle and stay connected to her extended family? The decision about whether to move to Houston would require careful consideration of everyone's needs and priorities, forcing the family to explicitly examine the nature of their relationships and their commitment to staying together despite changing circumstances. The conversations they would need to have about the future would reveal whether the bonds they had built were strong enough to survive prosperity as well as adversity, whether their evolved family structure could adapt to new challenges while maintaining its essential character of mutual love and respect. As they entered this new phase of decision-making and planning, all three members of their unconventional family carried different hopes and fears about what lay ahead. Emma's primary concern was keeping Maria as part of their lives, regardless of where they lived or how their circumstances changed. Jonathan's focus was on balancing professional opportunities with family stability, ensuring that career advancement didn't come at the cost of the emotional growth and closer relationships they had achieved. Maria's worry was about maintaining her place in their lives while also protecting her own security and dignity as they navigated whatever changes lay ahead. The Houston job opportunity represented both possibility and risk, potentially offering the chance to build on their emotional progress while creating new challenges related to social status, family structure, and long-term planning. How they handled this decision would reveal the true strength of the bonds they had formed and determine whether their story would continue to be one of growth and deepening connections, or whether external pressures would prove stronger than the love they had built together. The family meetings they held to discuss the Houston opportunity took place around the same kitchen table where Emma had first shared her family story, where they had celebrated birthdays and shared daily meals, where they had become comfortable being honest with each other about their needs and concerns. These conversations would test whether their improved communication and mutual respect were strong enough to navigate complex decisions that would shape all their futures. The question of what it meant to be a family, legally, emotionally, practically, had never been more important or more complicated for the three people who had chosen each other across all the barriers society had created to keep them apart. Their answer would determine not just where they lived or what work they did, but whether love could create the security and permanence that legal relationships were supposed to provide, but often failed to deliver. After several family discussions about the Houston job opportunity, during which each person's concerns and hopes were carefully aired and considered, Jonathan made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He turned down the position, choosing to prioritize the stability and emotional health they had achieved in Queens over the financial and professional advancement the new job would have provided. His explanation to the family revealed how much his understanding of success and wealth had evolved over the past 2 years. "I spent so many years thinking that making more money would make us happier," he said during one evening conversation. "But the truth is, we're happier now than we ever were when I was making millions. Emma is thriving. I'm actually present in my daughter's life, and we're a real family in ways we never were before. Why would I risk all that for more money?" Emma was thrilled by her father's decision, not just because it meant staying in the familiar environment they had learned to love, but because it demonstrated that he valued their relationships over external measures of success. The child's relief and joy at learning they wouldn't have to move revealed how important stability and continuity had become to her emotional well-being. For Maria, Jonathan's decision felt like validation of her worth to the family and recognition that their relationships were considered more valuable than financial opportunities. But she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with such recognition. Knowing that Jonathan had made professional sacrifices, partially to maintain their family structure, increased her sense of obligation to justify that decision through continued excellence in caring for Emma and supporting the household. The decision to stay in Queens also opened up new possibilities for deepening their community connections and long-term planning that wouldn't have been available if they were constantly moving in response to career opportunities. Emma could maintain friendships and continue at a school where she was known and valued. Jonathan could build on the progress he had made in his current job rather than starting over in a new environment. Maria could continue developing the social connections and community involvement that had enriched her life during their time in the neighborhood. As Emma approached her 10th birthday, she was becoming increasingly sophisticated in her understanding of family relationships and social structures. Her questions about Maria's status in their household became more direct and complex, reflecting her growing awareness that their family arrangement was unusual and that Maria's position might be more vulnerable than those of traditional family members. During one conversation about the future, Emma asked Maria directly, "Are you going to be my family forever, even when I grow up and don't need babysitting anymore?" The question cut straight to the heart of Maria's own uncertainties and fears. How could she promise forever when her position was still technically that of an employee? How could she offer assurance about the future when so much was still dependent on Jonathan's decisions and changing circumstances beyond her control? But looking at Emma's earnest face and understanding how much their relationship meant to the child, Maria chose to answer with her heart rather than her fears. "I will love you forever, no matter what," she said simply. "You are part of my heart, and nothing can change that." The conversation prompted Maria to begin thinking more seriously about ways to create legal and practical security for their relationship that wouldn't be dependent on employment arrangements or Jonathan's goodwill. She began researching options like legal guardianship, adoption by step-parent procedures, and other legal mechanisms that might provide more permanence to bonds that felt like family relationships but lacked legal recognition. Jonathan, overhearing some of these conversations and recognizing Emma's need for security about Maria's permanent place in their lives, began his own research into ways to formalize and protect their family structure. His legal troubles had taught him the importance of having proper documentation for relationships and arrangements that mattered, and he wanted to ensure that Maria's position in their family was as secure as possible. The process of exploring legal options for formalizing their family relationships revealed both possibilities and complications that none of them had fully considered. Adoption procedures were complex and would require Maria to essentially become Emma's legal parent, which raised questions about Jonathan's own parental rights and authority. Legal guardianship arrangements could provide Maria with some rights and protections, but were typically temporary measures rather than permanent solutions. More promising were trust arrangements and legal documents that could provide financial security for Maria's long-term care, while also creating formal recognition of her role in Emma's life. Jonathan could establish educational trusts that would fund Emma's future schooling, while also providing employment or care income for Maria. He could create legal documentation that would give Maria specific rights and protections in relation to Emma's welfare and their ongoing relationship. As they worked through these legal and practical considerations, all three family members were learning important lessons about the difference between emotional reality and legal recognition, between feeling like family and being legally protected as family. The process was educational and sometimes frustrating, revealing how much of family law was built around traditional nuclear family structures, and how little accommodation existed for chosen families and relationships built on love rather than biology. But the conversations also strengthened their bonds by making explicit what had previously been assumed, that they all wanted their relationship to continue permanently, that Emma's connection to Maria was considered as important to protect as any biological family relationship, that Jonathan valued Maria's presence in their lives enough to invest time, energy, and resources in formalizing and securing it. The legal research process took several months and involved consultations with family law attorneys who helped them understand their options and create documentation that would provide the maximum security possible within existing legal frameworks. The documents they ultimately created included employment contracts that provided Maria with long-term job security, medical decision-making powers that would allow her to advocate for Emma's health care when needed, and trust arrangements that would ensure her financial security even after Emma no longer needed daily caregiving. More symbolically important was the creation of a family charter, a document that outlined their commitments to each other, their shared values, and their intentions for maintaining their relationships regardless of changing circumstances. While not legally binding in the same way as adoption or marriage documents, the charter provided emotional security and official recognition of bonds that had been built over years of shared experience and mutual care. Emma participated enthusiastically in creating the family charter, contributing ideas about what commitments they should make to each other and what values they wanted to uphold as a family unit. Her input was sophisticated and thoughtful, reflecting her deep understanding of what made their relationships work and what protections she wanted for their continued connection. The completed family charter included commitments to prioritize each other's emotional well-being, to maintain open and honest communication, to make important decisions together as much as possible, and to protect and nurture their relationships regardless of external pressures or changing circumstances. It also included practical provisions about education, health care, and financial responsibilities that would guide their interactions in various scenarios. The signing of the family charter took place on Emma's 10th birthday, making it part of a celebration that honored both her growing maturity and their evolving family bonds. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, held in their kitchen with the same intimacy and authenticity that characterized all their most important family moments. As Emma signed her name to the document that formally recognized Maria as a permanent part of their family, she said, "Now it's official that we belong to each other forever." Her words captured exactly what the charter meant to all of them, not just legal protection, but emotional recognition and formal acknowledgement of bonds that transcended traditional family categories. For Maria, signing the family charter felt like the culmination of years of hoping and working for security and recognition. The document didn't solve all the vulnerabilities inherent in her position, but it provided substantial protection and official acknowledgement of her importance to Emma and Jonathan. More importantly, it demonstrated their commitment to maintaining their relationships and their recognition that she was family in all the ways that truly mattered. Jonathan's participation in creating and signing the charter represented the final stage of his long journey from emotional distance to full engagement with family relationships. The man who had once seen Maria as merely an employee now was voluntarily creating legal and financial structures to ensure her permanent place in their family. His transformation from neglectful father to engaged parent and from dismissive employer to grateful family member was complete. As they celebrated Emma's 10th birthday and the signing of their family charter, all three members of their chosen family felt a sense of completion and security that none of them had experienced before. Emma had the stable, loving family she needed for healthy development, with two adults who were committed to her well-being and to each other. Maria had the recognition, security, and love she had hoped for when she first took the job caring for Emma. Jonathan had learned to build the kind of authentic family relationships that his own childhood had lacked, creating for Emma the emotional wealth that no financial portfolio could provide. Their story had evolved from one of employer-employee relationships marked by distance and inequality to one of chosen family bonds secured by legal protection and mutual commitment. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, requiring crisis, growth, and courage from all three participants. But the result was a family structure that honored both emotional reality and practical needs, providing security and love that transcended traditional categories while still functioning within existing social and legal systems. As they looked toward Emma's adolescent years and the continued evolution of their relationships, all three family members felt optimistic about their future together. They had built something precious and lasting, something that could withstand challenges and changes while maintaining its essential character of mutual love and respect. The family charter they had signed represented more than just legal protection. It was a promise to continue choosing each other, to continue growing and adapting together, to continue creating the kind of family that honored everyone's needs and celebrated everyone's contributions. Their story would continue to unfold, but its foundation was now secure, built on love, recognition, and legal protection that would endure whatever changes lay ahead. Emma's 10th birthday party, celebrating both her continued growth and the formalization of their family bonds, was filled with the same warmth and authenticity that had characterized their best moments together. Surrounded by neighborhood friends, community connections, and the legal security of their family charter, Emma glowed with the confidence and joy that came from knowing she was thoroughly loved and permanently secure in the relationships that mattered most to her. The cake Maria had baked, the games Jonathan had planned, the friends Emma had invited, all of it represented the kind of celebration that prioritized relationship and connection over display and expense. The birthday party was a perfect reflection of the family they had become, genuine, warm, mutually supportive, and focused on creating joy together rather than impressing others with their success or status. As the evening wound down and Emma prepared for bed, she reflected on what had made this birthday so special. "I think this was my best birthday ever," she told both adults as they tucked her in, "because it wasn't just about getting older. It was about making our family official forever." Her words were a perfect summary of what they had accomplished together. They had created a family that worked for all of them, provided security and love for everyone involved, and honored the reality of relationships built on choice, commitment, and care. The legal documents and family charter were important, but they were simply formal recognition of bonds that had been forged through years of daily kindness, mutual support, and chosen love. So now I ask you, have you ever cared for someone who later forgot your name? Have you ever poured your heart into a child, a friend, or a family that never said thank you? Have you ever been the invisible hands that held a family together, the steady presence that provided comfort and stability, the faithful heart that loved without asking for anything in return? Tell me your story in the comments below. Because stories like Maria's remind us all of the silent heroes, the invisible warriors of love who shape lives through their dedication and care. Your service, your sacrifice, your quiet strength, it matters more than you know, and you deserve to be seen, honored, and celebrated. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches every caregiver who deserves to feel valued and recognized. Share this story with someone who is loved like Maria, who is served like Maria, who deserves to know that their contributions create family bonds that are real, lasting, and precious beyond measure. For more powerful stories that celebrate the heroes in ordinary places, the families built by choice rather than blood, the love that transcends legal documents and social barriers, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this path of the heart with us. We'll meet again in our next story, because every person who loves faithfully deserves to have their story told and their worth acknowledged. Remember, true family isn't just about who shares your DNA. It's about who shares your heart, your daily life, your struggles and celebrations. It's about who shows up, who stays, who loves without conditions or contracts. Maria's story is a reminder that the most important families are often the ones we choose, the bonds we build through time and care and faithful presence, the love that creates security more lasting than any legal document ever could.